Okay, so today I would like to talk about and then do a little bit of experimentation with um, Huatous and Koans, and just talk about them a bit in slightly to a little bit of it historically and some of it in terms of who engages with what practice and where our practice comes from. So it's a little bit of information, and then some talk about the actual difference between Huatous and Koans and what some of them are, and then we can experiment with them a little bit as well. So some of us may be very familiar with Koans and with Koan study, and perhaps some of us are familiar with Koans and Huatous or Hwadus, and I'm pluralizing it in the Western way. It may be that the plural of Huatu is Huatu, but for our purposes, it's a little easier to say it that way. I think it's worthwhile to go through it a little bit and just clarify some things about the nature of those practices and where they fit into our practice. So, in addition to our basic sitting meditation, that's based on either breathing or mindfulness of sensations and other phenomena that we experience when they arise in the moment, and our specialized just sitting and being present type of meditation practice. Zen practice has evolved over the centuries to use these different unique meditation devices that can help to awaken the mind in various ways. Expedient and skillful means, which is one of the keynotes of Buddhism. And we'll also find, as we do with other elements of Zen, that there are foreshadowings or instances of these things already existing in the early Buddhist teachings. Most of them don't come out of thin air, but are developments, further developments of things that are inherent or even explicit in the original Buddhist practices. And of course, I think they had 108 meditation objects in the early Buddhist practice as well. And you'd sometimes get a specialized object of meditation for yourself from your teacher. But most people would wind up doing the basic mindfulness of breathing and those other kinds of very popular practices. But it's not completely unusual to have these additional techniques. So two of the major meditation devices that have grown up in the different Zen schools are Huatu or Hwadu in the Korean pronunciation, and of course much better known to us in the West and even in the Japanese tradition are the Zen Koans, known literally as public cases because they were often given by a Zen teacher to his or her monastic community as a group to contemplate or respond to. They then became a little less public when they started becoming the subject of meetings, individual private meetings between the teacher and the student in whatever setting. So the public case that had been originally given to a group became an object of contemplation for the individual doing the koan study. In brief, the Huatu is a long-term object of direct contemplation or meditation that may be engaged for a really long period of time, like for a number of years. It's possible that you could engage a Huatu for your whole meditation career. And it stops conceptual explanatory thought and opens the mind to the presence of reality in the moment and is a direct awakening tool. Some koans, like the famous Mu koan, may also be engaged for a very long period of time and used like a Huatous to have an initial breakthrough in understanding or realization. And then this can be followed up with a long series of additional koans. That happens in the koan traditions, and it also happens in some Huatous traditions where there's a period of study of Huatous for an initial breakthrough, and then it's followed up with koans. That's true in the Soensang Korean tradition that's pretty well known in the West, with his philosophy of don't know mind and having an attitude of don't know towards things in order to keep the mind open and awake. So why is there only one Huatous assigned to a person and many, many koans? Well, the Huatous, to use a kind of gross metaphor, is kind of like an overall cleanser for the mind. It has a very strong and continuous effect that keeps the mind engaged and keeps clearing it out of deluded thoughts. The koans, on the other hand, cover a wide variety of issues, stories, problems, topics that pertain to what I would say are different parts of the mental set, beliefs, conditioning, as well as different aspects of Zen practice, both basic and advanced. And so they have rather specific effects on the mind when they are engaged. Some people would say that all the koans, are the same in essence and have the same awakening answer in a certain way. But to me, it seems like they are targeting parts of the deluded, conditioned mindset that we all carry and hitting specific areas. So to use another analogy, you could say that Huatous is like having a large a tumor or obstacle removed from your whole system, which frees up your whole mental system, while the koans are like various types of microsurgery that target specific areas of the mind, one after the other, and awaken specific delusions, or awaken us from specific delusions. As noted in Buddhism, we carry many delusions, and one of our basic vows is to see through all delusions in the mind, which is a really big agenda. Literally, that's impossible, but through working with hundreds of koans that challenge many different aspects of life, practice, and belief, many delusions, large and small, are confronted. And in finding the core or point of the koan, the turning word, as it's called, that opens it up, those delusions may be released and give way to a micro-awakening, or if you want to call it an insight, or an increase in insight and wisdom. And every time the mind awakens, it goes past a certain kind of deluded thinking or conditioned thinking. The frustrating aspect of both Huatous and koan study, which leads quite a few people to run away from them, is that they cannot be directly confronted. They can't be defeated by the conceptual mind, and they can't be broken by the conceptual mind. Like an elusive puzzle, but much more than that, they defy direct analysis, even though in retrospect the answer to a given koan may later seem obvious. And that's kind of an interesting experience too, when you look back at a koan and say, that was obvious, why didn't I see it? And it has to do with our thought processes that often look past what is apparent or present, and which is also a pretty good metaphor for awakening and delusion themselves. That the awakened mind is right in front of us, but a lot of times we can't see it. So who uses Huatous and who uses Koans, and how are they employed? Huatous, the existential questions that challenge our ordinary understanding of existence and self, were created by Zen master Dahui Zhanggao, who lived so recently, from 1089 to 1163. So Huatous have been around for a few years. He was a member of the Linji school, aka Rinzai Zen as we know it. And he invented it as a kind of a non-intellectual koan that could be used very easily, even with his students who were in remote parts of China and far away from him. They didn't have any trains. People would walk over the mountains or take a donkey. And they did have a good mail system, though, and many times Dahui corresponded with his students by mail, which I've remarked on several times, when I go on Zoom with Al or go into the group meetings, that, having and sometimes sending Al an answer to a koan by email, that, all seems very modern, but Dahui was doing that in the 1100s, sending letters back and forth with questions and answers and clarifications. I really like that it's just like an electronic version of something that's been going on for a long time. And so, since he was corresponding with students by mail or they were far away, the Huatous were able to be used independently for long periods of time with only, occasional written response and instruction. And they were designed to be handy that way. We'll talk about what they are specifically a little later. So then Korean master Chinul traveled in China in the 1100s, also in the 1100s, and he ran into the Huatous and was really taken by it. He just thought it was the greatest technique ever, which it may be. And he took it back with him to Korea. And it spread like wildfire through the Korean practice and became the premier method of San or Shan Korean practice, Korean Zen practice, and remains the center of Korean practice to this day. So if you're saying like, gee, Huatous, I haven't heard too much about that. I've heard of koans. Then you probably haven't been to a Korean temple lately, which I certainly have not. But in the Korean practice, it's the most common object or technique of meditation. Some schools use Huatous or Hwadus, as it's pronounced a little bit more in Korean, exclusively, and some do initial Hwadus practice and then follow it up with Zen koan study and go on to more multifarious koans. So if you're with a Huatous and you're working with it for years, it's a slightly different experience than going from one koan to the next and finding the answers. And I'll talk about that a little bit more too, that Hwadus don't actually have answers as opposed to Zen koans, which do. Zen koans are defined in Wikipedia as a, quote, story, dialogue, question, or statement that provokes the great doubt, and I changed that to just great doubt, and tests the student's progress in Zen. So they're both training tools and testing tools. And a lot of times in the ancient dialogues, you can find these long dialogues between master and monk where they're asking probing questions, getting an answer, then asking the slightly different way of saying, well, go further, what about this, or what about that, and testing and dialoguing the student's understanding in very specific ways and at some length. And sometimes a similar dialogue will come up again with another set of teachers and students, and again, these are like common ways that the masters would probe the student's understanding. Sometimes they'd give them a koan in response to something that they had talked about, and the student would come back 3 years later and say, okay, this is what I discovered. And that's really using the koan like a hwadu as a long-term probing tool. And for those of us who get frustrated when we can't resolve a koan in a week or two, try doing one for 3 years. So I made my own little statement based on the Wikipedia one, which is it's a story, dialogue, question, statement, or problem that challenges the mind's ordinary way of thinking and problem solving and forces a direct engagement or confrontation with the reality of the koan. Sometimes it can seem more like an engagement, and sometimes it can seem more like a confrontation, especially after getting a couple of wrong approaches to the koan and trying to redirect towards what the real core of it is. So in a moment, I'll talk about a few different kinds of Huatous and koans, but first a little sense of who in the Zen tradition uses which devices and where we fit in our school of open mind Zen. Something which I was pretty confused about for a while. I might even still wind up being confused, but because it's a little bit complex. But I did kind of look into it and get a little bit of clarification as to what's going on around here. So first there's Rinzai Zen, which is really the carrier of koan study. And Rinzai is almost wholly involved with koan study. It's just as Hwatu is the main method of Korean Zen, koan study and the progression of koans from one to the next with different categories of koans is really the core of Rinzai study. Now, if a Rinzai person was here, they would say, no, the core of Rinzai study is your meeting with the teacher. And the koan is just the subject matter. So you could look at it either way, but in the Rinzai tradition, it's considered critical that you are meeting and engaging with the teacher, generally speaking in person, although once you've had initial in-person meetings, it's possible to continue with some of the teachers online or through correspondence. But the in-person meeting and getting to see each other in living color with your full personality and energy present is considered vitally important, just as energy and the energy kind of presence of someone is considered very important in Rinzai. So initial meditation in Rinzai is deeply involved with breath regulation and breath control in order to work with the nervous system in a direct way. And then when koans are introduced, they're coordinated with the concentration on the breath and the focus on the hara, the central point in the belly, which is the central point for all Zen schools. There are those in Rinzai for whom koan study, even in Rinzai, is not found to be suitable. And some people, even in Rinzai, don't want to work on koans or find it too difficult. And they are still able to continue in Rinzai with other forms of meditation that they can be assigned. Continue with breathing and other techniques. But koan study is the norm. And that's where Rinzai, has reached its full development. I mean, that's where koan study has reached its full development. In Korean Zen, Hwadu study, as we have said, is the heart of the practice. And like koan study, the student will start with breathing meditation and then incorporate Hwadu as their main focus. Some schools, again, then go on to koan study. There are still some of the original Chinese Chan Zen schools around. And they may, some of those still utilize Hwatu as their main focus. The great master Zhu Yun, or Su Yun, depending on how you spell and pronounce it, was a great Hwatu master, and used that as a lot of his teaching. And he lived into fairly modern times. I don't remember exactly when he died, but he was not that many decades ago. So in China and in Huatous study, it was often combined with the most popular form of Buddhism, which is Pure Land practice. And Pure Land involves reciting the name of Maitreya Buddha as a kind of a mantra. And that's the kind of meditation that's practiced in order to attune oneself to Maitreya's frequency and gain rebirth in the Pure Land, which is one of the higher dimensions that are said to be a lot more pleasant than our earthly dimension, which you may have noticed has a few problems. And when you sneakily combine Huatous study with the Pure Land mantra meditation, you simply do the normal chanting. So you look like anybody else who's practicing Pure Land, but internally you're asking yourself the question, who is chanting? When you ask yourself the question, who is chanting, you've then turned Pure Land practice into an awakening practice. You're then asking, what is my identity? Who am I? What is my ultimate self? My true self? So that really is, and it's not a bad way to practice because the chanting has the effect of, it's one of the effective ways, mantra meditation, of putting yourself into samadhi. So it's not a bad combination. Go into samadhi through the chanting, keep yourself awake with the question. And you may get benefit from chanting the name of the coming Buddha as well, if you have any beliefs that are aligned with Pure Land. So in Soto Zen, koans and Huatous are not used at all. They have existed in the tradition in the deep and distant past, but in all of modern Soto Zen, pure direct meditation has been employed, and the koans that might have existed in the past were basically thrown out. So in pure Soto, shikantaza, just sitting, is the main technique, and more or less the only technique. And so the idea is just to be present to what is and to the nature of what is. And it's an offshoot of silent illumination teaching, which, as its name implies, is sitting quietly and allowing one's own mind to become illumined by being present and by, you could say, by focusing on presence itself in advanced shikantaza. So those were the basic schools, leaving aside other distinctions of the 5 schools of Chan that existed a long time ago. But then in 1954, Yasutani Roshi founded the Sambo school and radically created a lay school which combined Soto and Rinzai, outraging both the Sotos and the Rinzais. And what they would do is they would do some degree of Soto sitting meditation, being very present and open to the tathata, or presence of the present moment. And at the same time, they would work on the Rinzai koans. And this combination turns out to be a pretty good one. A good depiction of this combination and its results are in Philip Kaplow's important book, The 3 Pillars of Zen, which talks in detail about what the Sambo practice was like under Yasutani Roshi. One of the students of Yasutani, who then founded their own schools, was Robert Aitken Roshi. Another one was Maezumi Roshi, who founded the LA Zen Center. And Maezumi founded what he called the White Plum Asanga, which was his offshoot of Sambo. and it's from the Miyazumi lineage, and that started in the LA Zen Center, that our own open mind Zen school emerged. As Roshi Al studied with Miyazumi and the other white plum teachers at the LA Zen Center, as well as some of his other teachers. And basically, we have that combination today of sitting shikantaza, and for those who want to, working on koan study. And so we also engage with that combination, pure open sitting and koan study, going through many of the traditional volumes of the koan study tradition, with some additions and subtractions by Roshi Al. In open mind Zen, of course, koan study is not required, as it normally would be in regular Rinzai, but it's available. Those who prefer to engage in breathing meditation and just sitting meditation for their practice are free to do so, and that is a full practice in its own right that engages with the Soto type of way of practicing. And at any point, those who wish to engage in koan study can get instruction in that from Roshi Al and the OMZ teachers. So with all of that description, let's take a look at the specifics of some of the toolkits of Huatous and koan study. But before I talk a little bit about the specifics of Huatous and koans, does anybody have any questions about the description or the history that they'd like to clarify? We can take a few minutes for that if anybody does have a question.
Can you just tell me how to spell it? Because I've never heard that word, Huatous.
Okay.
So since I want to look up more or something that...
Yeah, that's a great question. You could definitely look it up. And there's not a bad description of it in Wikipedia. Wikipedia does pretty well these days. So it's spelled two different ways. The Chinese transliteration is, yeah, that's true. We could put it in the chat as Brad just did. The Korean and perhaps Vietnamese spelling is Hwadu. The Chinese spelling is Houtou. And I'll put that in as well. Yay for the chat. I'm going to utilize the chat in a little while too for some other stuff. H-U-A, T-O-U. So it can be either one word or two, and here it is. So Huatous is the Chinese version, and Hwadus is the Korean version. And Brad, is it in Vietnam? Is it also Hwadus?
I wouldn't know because by and large, Chan Zen is just a small minority, and then Pure Land really is what's most predominant form there. So they wouldn't study Hwadus. I've never heard of them doing it. They're just offshoots of the Chan Zen lineage, yeah.
Gotcha. Unless some of them are secretly doing that old trick that the Chinese did for centuries of doing Pure Land meditation and sneaking in the Chan practice.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
The Hwadus practice. Who's chanting? Yeah. Who's chanting?
Sure.
Okay, great. Any other questions? That was a good one, Diana. Okay, so we're good to go on. I'm just trying to close the chat. Okay, good. So here are some famous basic Huatous or Hwadus. The most famous and most popular is, who am I? That's a good question. And if who am I seems a little bit too personal and leads you to a lot of biographical kind of thoughts, then you can ask an even more basic question as your Huatous, which is, what am I? And that's, who am I has its benefits in being a little warmer and speaking to you as a person. Who am I? And what am I is a little bit more clinical and cuts off more from the personal element. So it really depends on what flavor, seems more useful for your inquiry into your true nature. And a Huatu teacher will either assign you a Huatu that they think is suitable for you, or in some cases they'll let you, find one that feels right and work with it. Pick one. The one rule of almost all the Huatu schools is once you've settled on one and started practicing with it, you're not supposed to switch. So you don't want to run around switching from one Huatu to another. I think the reasoning behind that is that if you don't continue with the Huatu, it's kind of like a long-term relationship. If you just say, oh, I'm tired of this one, I'm going to go to another one, you don't get too deep into the relationship. So, and when you get to a point with a Huatu where it's really bothering you and you want to break through it, you might have a temptation to just go find another one that you think is easier. So they'll say, just stick with that one and keep on going deeper. In fact, they say even after you have a breakthrough and you feel like you've kind of cracked through the Huatu and you feel pretty transformed, which can happen at a certain point, don't stop on that either. Just keep going deeper. So they don't really define much of a stopping point. So who am I? What am I? There's also one that's very famous in the White Plum group popularized by Bernie Glassman, famous White Plum Roshi, which is what is this? And what is this? Or no, actually, he would say, what is it? He wouldn't say this. He would say, what is it? Which is even harder. I like what is this because it's pointing you towards this current reality. What is it? You're asking about this. He would just say, what is it? And he'd come into a room and scream, what is it? And that's one way to do it. So what is this or what is it is another popular Huatu. Then there are some other ones. One which, I've heard a few times and which I like a lot is, if you're sitting and listening to nature sounds or you're just sitting out in nature, who is it that's listening? Who is listening to the sound of the birds singing? It's a little bit long-winded, but I like that a lot. I'm not sure if I heard it exactly like that or extrapolated it, but I really like there is definitely one of who is listening to sounds, and the meditation on sound and inquiring into how is the sound being heard, who's listening to it is very powerful. And you can also do the Pure Land one, which is who is chanting the name of the Buddha. Very popular in China and I guess in parts of Japan and in Vietnam. So, I don't know if that was popular in Vietnam, but Pure Land is. So, more Huatus. What was my original face before my parents were born is considered a Huatu that can be used for long-term use. And it's also one of the koans in the koan series, so sometimes they overlap. And, the famous Mu koan, which is the monk asked Joshu, does a dog have the Buddha nature? And Joshu said Mu, which is, actually said Wu in Chinese, which is a very multi-definable word in Chinese and Japanese because it can mean no, not, or nothing, or absence, depending on the context. So it's really a deep koan if you understand that Mu doesn't necessarily just mean no. And derived from that is a popular Huatu, which is what is Mu? So you take something from an important koan and turn it into a question, and you've got a Huatu. Then there's Su Yun, the modern Chinese master who really worked the Huatus very strongly with his students. His favorite Huatu, which he may have made up, which I happen to love, is a little macabre, might be heavy medicine for some people, but it's who is dragging this corpse around? And I really like that because to me, it gives me a sense of looking at the body in a certain way. And It's another way of saying who am I in a sense, but it's just very, it's kind of very concrete and graphic in a sense. Who is dragging this corpse around? So even in early Buddhist practice in India, in some suttas, the practitioner was advised not just to walk, but to ask themselves, who goes? Whose is this going? Which to say in modern language, who is walking? Which is very similar to the Huatous tradition. And here's a quote of what Chinese Chan master Su Yun said about practicing the Huatous. The important thing is to stick to Huatous at all times, when walking, lying down, and standing. From morning to night, observing Huatous vividly and clearly until it appears in your mind like the autumn moon reflected limpidly in quiet water. If you practice this way, you can be assured of reaching the state of enlightenment. So I think that's a really lovely practice pointer from Master Su Yun, who meditated almost continuously and very strongly for many, 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 many years and lived till over 100. One of the nice things about the Huatous is that you can take it to work, keep it in mind while working, as long as you're not working with dangerous mechanical machinery, or doing other activities. It has continuous practice potential. In some cases, koans do too. Sometimes they seem a little bit long for that kind of practice while engaged with activity. So before we take a quick look at koans, and I realize that I'm also taking a rather long talk, and I'd like to have a few minutes for practice when we get to it. If everybody is okay staying till 8:15, or does anybody have to leave at 8 on the dot? Okay, now I'll go a few extra minutes. Thank you for that. Let's take a little practice just for 2 or 3 minutes. Try one of these Huatous on for size. We can pick one from the list, and I'm going to put the list into the chat, and I'll also run through it one more time without the additional comments. So let me throw it into the chat. And okay, here's the chat, and here's the list. So there's who am I? What am I? What is this? Also, what is it, if you really want to go out on a limb? Who is listening to the sound of the birds? That works better if there are birds nearby. You could also say who's listening to the sound of the fan, or who's listening to the sound of the cars. Whatever you happen to hear, if you like sound. Who is chanting the name of the Buddha? If you wanted to try chanting, I don't actually remember the exact chant, but Brad might know it. It's something Namo. Yeah, I could look it up, but that's okay. What was my original face before my parents were born, which is a little more of a far out one. What is Mu, if you're familiar with the Mu koan? And Su Yun's favorite, who is dragging this corpse around? So pick one, and we'll sit for a couple of minutes, and then we'll see what you all may experience. Now, I just want to say a word about how to look at the Huatous before we do that. So here's my instruction for the moment, and if you find that you have a slightly better way of engaging it, feel free to deviate from my instruction. So I would say simply ask yourself the question, for instance, who am I? And then let it sit in the space in front of you, aka let it sit in your mind or mental space, and see what opens up or how that opens up the space. Breathe into the question, and anytime you feel like it, just review the question again. So you can say it multiple times, but don't turn it into a mantra and say it continuously. Just say it and consider what it means and what it does for your mind. See what comes up. Don't try to answer the question. It's not meant to have a literal answer, but see how the question affects your sense of self or your sense of perception of the present moment. your experience of being here. So with that said, we'll take a couple of minutes to engage with your chosen Huatu. So I'll just start by saying that I decided to ask myself who is listening to the sounds of the room and just listening to the kind of buzzing and the fan sounds. And what I found really interesting about it, not having done this, I worked on Huatu for a while before I was doing Koan study and really enjoyed it. But going back to it, I noticed, A, that it focused me on the sounds. So there's an element of mindfulness to doing this practice. And I also remembered that there's that once you get used to doing a Huatu, you don't have to ask yourself the whole sentence necessarily once you know what it is. So I just started asking myself who while I was listening to the sounds, who. And that way I was able to engage with the sound and the question a little more easily. How was the experience for you, and what did you decide to engage with? I would actually, just out of personal curiosity, I'd love to know what you did or how it went. Oh, I wouldn't mind going around the room and just letting everybody briefly say, unless anybody doesn't want to. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good Huatu experience, a pretty good Huatu meditation. And you see what the potential of these little questions has for opening something up. Well, you can, if you did get an answer and you feel like you're kind of stuck with it, you can ask yourself the follow-up question, what is warm? Not what does warm mean, but what is it that's warm? Well, I would just suggest, I mean, if you want to try engaging with this anytime, that you try to, if you do get an answer, that you kind of put it to the side and keep asking the question, get a sense of how you see yourself. I think that's also a good point that you raise, which is you absolutely can incorporate these into your practice. So if you're focusing and working on the hara and grounding yourself in the belly, you can take the Huatu and put it there where you're concentrating and concentrate on the Huatu in the hara. So that's a very Rinzai way of practicing, and it's perfectly legitimate. Cool. I'll just note in passing that the Buddha had his version of dragging the corpse around. He said, Ananda, I have gotten old, and my body is like an old cart that creaks and halts and continues, with difficulty. He said, I only find relief when I enter into the fourth jhana, which is the fourth level of samadhi. So we're all in the same boat. Cool. And I like that sense that certain aspects come up and then deepen into other things. Great. And that reminds me that I forgot to mention Al's current Huatu, which he mentioned, he didn't define it that way, but it's what he mentioned in passing that he's working on a couple of times that he finds really intriguing, which I think is a great Huatu, which is what is aware. And that's a really lovely one that he came up with and very core. My recollection is that Su Yun, who came up with that koan, almost drowned at one point in his life and had to be revived. And I believe that he had physical difficulties and was in pain his whole life, as I vaguely recall. So I think that he had a similar relationship to that Huatu of, this painful thing that I'm connected to here, who is it that's involved in this whole thing? Well, he said corpse, but you can,
Okay.
I don't think there's any Huatu teacher that would object to you saying body.
Interesting.
Yeah, it has just like you can say, who am I? Or you can say, what am I?
Right.
Different flavors. So if you don't want to say corpse, where you're saying like, in a sense, if you say corpse, you're saying this thing is already dead. I reject this body in a way. If you just want to say body and say who's carrying this body around, that's like asking who is embodied.
Yeah.
And so it's got a flavor that some people might like more. Yeah. Just like you might have some people who are into, silent illumination, yay. And then there was a school of dead tree sitting. Where, that might be a little bit too strong medicine for some people. So you want to know how to practice? Be like a dead tree. Boom,
Oh,
I find that kind of appealing too. So koans are like Huatu in that they don't have a logical answer. They're more about seeing into the nature of the question, problem, or story. And then an answer emerges. Many times the answer to a koan is in the form of a demonstration. Sometimes the monk would respond by yelling or leaving or saying something illogical or hitting the teacher, which we don't do anymore. Or one guy, turned the stove over in the Zen story when the teacher asked him a question. He said, okay, fine, here goes your stove. But so, those are kind of extreme. But the answer is not always verbal, is the main point. It can be a demonstration of some kind. And there are also different kinds of koans. Now, in Rinzai, the koans are categorized according to, whether they're basic and whether they're pre-awakening or post-awakening. And then there are ones that deal with very subtle issues that are in advanced practice. But I just want to give a quick, loose description of different types of koans that doesn't have anything to do with that. Just to say that some of them are very concrete and that their purpose seems to be to get us to come into contact with reality and stop spinning around in our heads. So, and that's certainly one of the, one of the things that is a result of Zen practice, breathing and being in the moment and not going into a totally conceptual and imaginational type of place, but to come into contact with reality and with embodiment and to be present in the moment and in the real current situation. So an example of that kind of koan is Joshu's, wash your bowls. And that's a very famous one where the monk asks Joshu something like, what is Buddha? Or, what is the essence of Zen? One of the classic questions. And I don't remember which one. And Joshu says, well, have you eaten your rice? And the monk says, yes. The Joshu says, well, then go wash your bowls. So he takes the whole question of the esoteric, what is Zen? What is Buddha? And he says, this is reality. And that's where you want to be grounded. So that's a very concrete way of coming in for a landing, as I like to call it, and getting in touch with the present reality and being here rather than somewhere else. And that's one type of koan. Then there's another kind of koan that is sort of like that, but it's a little bit hard to get a handle on it, even though it seems very simple. And that would be like the monk asked, I don't remember if it was Joshu or not, it might have been someone else. But the monk asked the master, what is Buddha? And the master answered, the oak tree in the garden. Actually, it's the cypress tree in the garden. It's translated as a lot of different trees. And that one has kind of, it's so simple and so direct, but in another way, it's kind of hard to get a handle on it. So it's something like that that's very naturalistic and very concrete, but at the same time, it's hard to understand what it means. So that's considered a pretty advanced koan that people have spent many years on. Well, I have a story, but I'll tell it another time. So then there are ones that are paradoxical and that are setups. They're not real stories as far as we know, but they're created to make it impossible for you to give a logical, conceptual answer. And you have to go to another place to find the answer. And examples of that are like, you're on top of a 100-foot pole, how do you take your next step? Another one like that is, you're hanging from a cliff holding on by your teeth, and someone asks you to explain the Dharma. And the idea being that you're obligated to explain the Dharma if somebody asks you to expound it for them. So how do you avoid falling off the cliff? You're holding on by your teeth. You can't reach the branches. So those are really difficult koans that challenge your logical mind and force you to go to a different place. And then another one of that sort is, what is the sound of one hand? That one was created by Hakuin, Rinzai Master Hakuin, and that's a really cool one because what is the sound of one hand? You can't really answer it very easily. So these are difficult to answer and require one to go beyond conceptual thinking. Another kind of koan suggests an approach to living or reality and kind of demonstrates a way of being and asks us to engage with it. And one of my favorites in that group is the Wandering Master in Blue Cliff Record number 36. And this is one I think everybody can kind of understand on its face, but it has potential to go deeper. So one day Changsha went wandering in the mountains. Upon returning, when he got to the gate, the head monk asked, "Where are you coming from, master?" Sha said, "From wandering in the mountains." The head monk asked, "Where did you go?" Sha said, "First I went pursuing the fragrant grasses. Then I returned, following the falling flowers." The head monk said, "How very much like the sense of springtime." Sha said, It even surpasses the autumn dew dripping on the lotuses. So that's a very beautiful, very lush, naturalistic kind of koan, but it also suggests this way of being where you have no agenda, you have nowhere to go. In a way, you don't have a self that's planning and controlling things. You just go where where the outdoors takes you, and then you find your way back the same way. So it kind of is suggestive of this way of being that's kind of outside of time and schedules and plans and control and ego, but is just in this other mode of being free. So that's a little bit of the range of koans. And there are many others that touch on different areas of the self and the mind. So I think I can get away with giving us 2 minutes of practice and then a couple more minutes of discussion, if that's okay with everybody. Take us to around 8:20. I would say, why don't we just engage for a couple of minutes with this idea of, have you eaten your rice? Yes. Well, then wash your bowls, and what that brings up for you if you go over it in your mind a few times. We're not looking for an answer. We're just trying to see what effect that koan has on your thinking. So if we can go around the room again, you can just give me a quickie snapshot of how that affected you or what you thought about working with it. I'll go last this time. Why don't we go to Angie first this time? Just if you engaged with, have you eaten your rice? Yes, well then wash your bowls, how that was for you or what it evoked. You know, if the koan brings something up that's really happening, that might be okay, you know?
Yeah.
It's got a correspondency there. You know, it's like, no, I want my rice. You know, give me my that's why I say that those kinds of koans, you know, they help you come in for a landing in the here and now, like you say, how they serve it. You know, it reminds me that the koans can be medicine. at times. Well, that's why I like to go back to them when I'm not working on them.
Yeah, yeah.
Because, like I go back to the oak tree in the garden, which is now, I find out, a cypress tree. But I go back to that cypress tree in the garden over and over again because it's a place that I can go to where there's none of the stuff, and
Mm.
I can rest in it. In Rinzai, they say that koan is like a thief. Well, I mean, I think that's really significant what you bring up, and I think that's a big point of the koan is that you want to know what Buddha is? Complete your action. That's the Buddha. Complete your action. And it reminds me of another koan where this guy is sorting the rice, and he's got all the rice sorted out, and he's really happy with his work. And the master comes in and says, "So have you sorted the rice?" And he says, "Yes, I've sorted the rice." And the master points to a grain on the floor and he says, "What about that piece?" My wife noted to me recently that, you're pretty good at doing your laundry, but it takes you about a week to fold it. So my response to eat rice, wash bowl was wow. That is such a great way to live. If you could just do that, if you could just eat the rice and then wash the friggin' bowl, and that's it. And like you said, what is there to do next? What if your whole life was like that? It's like not, but just eat rice, wash bowl. So that's what it left me with. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our session. Thanks for sticking with me. And I really had a great time with you all.